I told you, you can't be here. The funeral is over, you can't stay.
She's here. I can't leave her. Just a little longer.
Listen.
Police tased a grieving veteran. 7 minutes later, the Hells Angels arrived. When Officer Derek Bradley tased 72-year-old Frank Monroe for refusing to leave Arlington Cemetery after hours, he didn't know Frank had buried his wife that morning, or that Hells Angels considered the Vietnam vet family. October twilight painted Arlington National Cemetery in shades of gold and shadow. As closing time approached, the sacred 639 acres, holding over 400,000 souls, beneath white marble headstones that stretched like fallen dominoes across rolling hills. At 5:15 p.m., groundskeepers prepared for evening lockdown, while security guards began final sweeps through sections where grieving families often lingered beyond posted hours, unable to say goodbye to dreams buried in hallowed ground that held America's finest. Frank Monroe knelt beside fresh earth in Section 60, his 72-year-old frame folded over the grave that had swallowed his heart, along with Maria's casket that morning. 48 years of marriage reduced to a rectangle of disturbed soil marked by temporary placard. Maria Elena Monroe, beloved wife of Vietnam veteran Franklin J. Monroe. His weathered hand scarred from Khe-Sanh shrapnel and decades of rebuilding Harley engines traced invisible letters in dirt that held his universe. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star ribbons meant nothing now. Maria had been his only medal that mattered. Her final whisper echoed through memory. "Keep riding, mi amor. I'll wait at the last stop." For 30 years after Vietnam, Frank had found brotherhood with Hells Angels East Coast chapter, earning his patch through loyalty rather than violence. Maria had understood that the club-filled spaces combat had carved from his soul men who'd seen darkness and chose brotherhood over bitterness. When arthritis forced him to sell his shovelhead, the Angels had honored him as lifetime member whose military service and faithful friendship transcended active riding. Some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the hardest battles you fight alone when your heart stops beating, but your body keeps going. "Sir, cemetery's closed. Time to leave." Arlington Cemetery, Police Officer Derek Bradley approached with routine authority, unaware he was about to make a decision that would bring motorcycle justice to hallowed ground where America's warriors found eternal rest. Frank didn't move from Maria's grave, his voice barely audible above autumn wind that rustled through memorial trees. "Need a few more minutes, officer. Buried my wife this morning." Bradley had been having the worst month of his 15-year career internal affairs investigation. Mandatory anger management classes, captain's warning that his next incident would trigger suspension. His ex-wife's lawyer had made it clear any sign of professional instability would cost him weekends with his daughter Sophie. "Sir, regulations are regulations. Cemetery closes at 5 p.m. sharp, no exceptions for personal circumstances." "She was afraid of the dark," Frank whispered, his words carrying weight of man who'd never let Maria sleep alone in 48 years. "Can't start tonight." Bradley's 5 years of marriage fallen apart had armor-plated his heart against emotional appeals that reminded him of his own losses. Empty apartment, silence echoing with Sophie's laughter before divorce destroyed everything he'd cared about. "Sir, personal problems don't override federal property regulations. Leave now or face arrest for trespassing." Frank's hand pressed against cold earth that contained his reason for living. "Officer, I got nowhere else to go. She was my home." Those words hit too close to Bradley's truth, loneliness waiting for him. Memories of what love used to feel like before lawyers divided hearts into assets and liabilities. Bradley's training emphasized control over compassion, regulations over human decency. His supervisor, Captain Reynolds, had been explicit. Zero tolerance for after-hours violations. Cemetery security depends on consistent enforcement regardless of sob stories. But Frank recognized familiar pain in Bradley's rigid stance, defensive posture of man fighting his own battles while maintaining professional facade that protected him from additional wounds. "Officer, what's eating at you?" Frank asked with gentleness, earned through 30 years of helping broken veterans find peace. "Taking it out on grieving widower won't fix whatever's hurting inside you." The observation stung because it was accurate. Bradley's personal pain bleeding into professional decisions, need for control manifesting as inflexibility that served no one's interests while reflecting his own emotional damage. "I don't need relationship counseling from trespassers," Bradley snapped, anger revealing wounds Frank had touched with surgical precision. "Son, I'm not counseling anybody, just asking for human decency on day I buried woman who taught me what love means." 50 yards away, Michael "Torch" Kowalski finished placing flowers on his squad leader's grave when he heard familiar voice that made his heart skip. Frank Monroe, the Hell's Angel who'd helped him rebuild his life after Afghanistan took his legs and left him broken. "Frank?" Torch called out, recognizing his sponsor's voice despite years since they'd last met. The Hell's Angels Road. Captain approached on custom Harley adapted for his prosthetic legs. Patches identifying him as member of Brotherhood that had saved both their lives. "Torch! Jesus, look at you," Frank said, his tear-stained face brightening with recognition of young veteran he'd mentored through darkest period following medical discharge. Bradley felt outnumbered, but couldn't show weakness that might be reported to supervisors already questioning his judgment since divorce proceedings began affecting work performance. "Both of you need to leave immediately. This is federal trespassing violation." "Officer, this is Frank Monroe," Torch said with quiet intensity earned through combat and recovery. "He's burying his wife today. Show some respect for grieving veteran." But Bradley's personal pain had metastasized into professional rigidity that saw threats where none existed, authority challenges and simple human requests for compassion during vulnerable moments. Respect for federal regulations. Comply or face consequences, Bradley replied, drawing his taser with theatrical authority designed to regain control of situations spiraling beyond his comfort zone. Frank stood slowly, his dignity intact despite obvious physical frailty. "Derek, do what you need to do. I'm staying with Maria." The electrical shock dropped Frank across his wife's grave as Torch screamed into his phone. All angels, Frank Monroe down at Arlington Section 60. They tased our brother. Emergency response, now. Sometimes the family that chooses you rides faster than the one you're born into, especially when brotherhood means more than blood. Torch's emergency alert reached Hell's Angels chapters across the D.C. area within minutes. Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware chapters whose members had shared brotherhood with Frank Monroe through decades of loyalty that transcended active membership status when arthritis ended his riding but not his place in their family. "Pulse weak, breathing shallow," Torch reported while performing battlefield medicine on man who taught him to live again after Afghanistan took his legs. Frank sponsored half the vets in our chapter, never broke confidence, always answered midnight calls when demons came hunting. Bradley stared at Frank's motionless form, processing catastrophic implications of tasing 72-year-old veteran on his wife's burial day, while Hell's Angels numbers grew from individual arrivals to organized formations surrounding platform, where their respected brother lay unconscious. "I didn't know he was important," Bradley stammered, watching Torch work to stabilize cardiac rhythm disrupted by electrical shock that could prove fatal in an elderly man whose heart had been broken before police violence nearly stopped it permanently. "Every person is important," Torch replied with controlled fury while monitoring Frank's vital signs. "But Frank Monroe is legend, Vietnam Purple Heart, 30 years Hell's Angels, sponsored to dozens of broken veterans who found family when blood relatives gave up on them." Within 10 minutes, distinctive Harley rumbles began echoing through Arlington's sacred grounds as Hell's Angels members arrived from across the metropolitan area, their presence transforming routine police incident into potential confrontation between civilian authority and motorcycle brotherhood whose loyalty transcended jurisdictional boundaries. Arlington Cemetery administration immediately called for backup as Hell's Angels numbers grew from individual concerns to organized response surrounding Frank's position, where their honorary brother lay unconscious from police assault that violated every principle of respect they'd learned through his example. "We've got approximately 20 Hell's Angels members in Section 60, reported Cemetery Security Chief Walsh to Arlington County Dispatch. "Situation is controlled, but tense. They're providing medical support to assault victim." But bureaucratic obstacles emerged as Arlington County Police arrived with jurisdictional concerns about unauthorized gathering on federal property, requiring permits for large assemblies that could take weeks to obtain through proper channels. "This is unauthorized assembly on federal cemetery grounds," announced Cemetery Director Patricia Williams, while federal regulations prohibited large gatherings without authorization that balanced security concerns with constitutional rights to peaceful assembly. "Director Williams, we're providing medical assistance to veteran who was assaulted during lawful cemetery visitation," replied Bones McKenzie, Hell's Angels East Coast president, whose authority commanded respect through different means than government institutions. Arlington County Police Chief Roberta Martinez arrived to find jurisdiction dispute between federal property, motorcycle organization, and local authority that standard procedures couldn't resolve through normal law enforcement protocols when constitutional rights intersected with cemetery regulations. The irony wasn't lost on experienced officers, Hell's Angels providing better emergency care than cemetery police, whose officer had created medical crisis through unnecessary use of force against vulnerable elderly veteran during grief counseling moment. Frank regained consciousness to find himself surrounded by Hell's Angels whose protective formation honored 30 years of brotherhood through mechanical expertise and personal integrity that had earned respect across entire motorcycle community despite organizational stereotypes. "Frank, how you feeling?" Torch asked while coordinating with arriving paramedics about treating electrical trauma in elderly veteran whose cardiac condition could be compromised by shock administered without cause or justification by officer whose authority exceeded his wisdom. "Like I got hit by North Vietnamese artillery," Frank whispered with humor intact, despite obvious cardiac distress and recognition that his simple request to grieve had escalated into federal incident requiring congressional investigation and media scrutiny. Bradley realized his personal problems had created institutional crisis, requiring explanation to supervisors, federal investigators, and Hell's Angels leadership, whose members had every legal right to protect vulnerable ally from additional persecution by authorities whose training failed to recognize military service requiring honor rather than enforcement. Officer Bradley, explain your decision to use electrical force against elderly veteran visiting his wife's grave on burial day, demanded Chief Martinez, while processing subordinate's career-ending assault on military hero whose reputation was legendary throughout motorcycle community that valued character over credentials. The emotional weight of Frank's situation, Vietnam veteran tased while grieving wife's death on federal cemetery grounds, created perfect storm of public relations disaster involving veteran mistreatment, federal property violation, and motorcycle club response that challenged every stereotype about outlaw organizations protecting vulnerable members. Emergency medical evaluation revealed Bradley's taser had triggered cardiac arrhythmia in Frank's 72-year-old cardiovascular system, requiring immediate hospitalization for monitoring that could prevent fatal complications from electrical trauma administered without medical justification during grief counseling session. Mr. Monroe needs immediate cardiac evaluation at Walter Reed Medical Center, announced paramedic supervisor, while Hell's Angels coordinated escort, ensuring their honorary brother received appropriate medical care during crisis created by police misconduct. But Hell's Angels numbers continued growing as word spread through motorcycle community about assault on Frank Monroe, chapters from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, converging on Arlington in largest coordinated response to veteran mistreatment since organization's founding by veterans seeking brotherhood after combat service. We're at 35 members now, reported Torch to chapter presidents coordinating response that balanced legitimate concern for Frank's welfare with need to avoid confrontation that would distract from medical emergency requiring immediate attention rather than political posturing. Bradley faced federal charges for assault on veteran, while his personal problems, divorce, custody battle, financial stress, were revealed during internal affairs investigation that exposed emotional instability, affecting professional judgment in ways that endangered innocent civilians whose only crime was loving too deeply to abandon deceased spouse. When personal pain meets professional power, innocent people pay the price for battles that aren't theirs to fight, while brotherhood rises to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Frank's recovery was complicated by revelation that Maria's death had triggered severe depression requiring psychiatric evaluation alongside cardiac treatment for electrical trauma that had nearly killed him during grief that already pushed his mental health beyond normal limits established by decades of combat and civilian stress. Mr. Monroe, losing spouse after 48 years, creates psychological trauma requiring professional intervention beyond cardiac care, explained psychiatrist Dr. Michael Rodriguez during evaluation that revealed Frank's suicidal ideation since Maria's death had made him vulnerable to police violence that could have been fatal. "Doc, without Maria, I got no reason to wake up tomorrow," Frank admitted with honesty that shocked medical staff who'd focused on cardiac damage without recognizing deeper emotional wounds requiring healing that cemetery policies hadn't anticipated or prepared for adequately. Bradley's assault had endangered veteran whose grief already threatened his survival, creating medical emergency that extended beyond physical trauma into psychological crisis, requiring comprehensive intervention that federal regulations couldn't address through standard enforcement procedures designed for routine security rather than humanitarian emergencies. Meanwhile, bureaucratic obstacles prevented Hell's Angels from maintaining promised protection at Maria's grave due to federal regulations requiring permits, supervision, and compliance procedures that prioritized institutional control over emotional support for grieving families whose needs transcended administrative convenience. President McKenzie, cemetery regulations prohibit unauthorized motorcycle ceremonies without proper federal authorization. Director Williams insisted, despite obvious cruelty of abandoning promise to Frank about protecting Maria from darkness she'd feared throughout life. Hell's Angels faced choice between following regulations that abandoned their brother or violating federal procedures to honor commitment that transcended bureaucratic compliance, but could result in criminal charges affecting members whose loyalty had already been tested through Frank's crisis. "Brothers, we gave Frank our word that Maria wouldn't be alone," Bones announced during emergency chapter meeting. Hell's Angels don't break promises to family, regardless of federal paperwork or government threats about unauthorized assemblies. Frank's psychiatric evaluation revealed that Bradley's assault had occurred during mental health crisis, requiring immediate intervention to prevent suicide attempt by elderly veteran whose reason for living had been buried that morning alongside wife who'd sustained him through Vietnam nightmares and civilian struggles. Representatives, Mr. Monroe's psychiatric condition demonstrates how police assault on grieving veterans can trigger psychological emergencies requiring specialized intervention rather than standard law enforcement responses, testified Dr. Rodriguez during congressional hearing about cemetery security failures that enabled veteran mistreatment. Bradley faced federal prosecution while his personal problems revealed during investigation generated sympathy from observers who recognized how divorce, custody battles, and financial stress could affect professional judgment without excusing assault on vulnerable veterans whose military service deserved institutional protection rather than individual persecution. Officer Bradley's personal struggles explain but don't justify tasing elderly veteran during mental health crisis, observed federal prosecutor during arraignment that balanced individual accountability with recognition of systematic failures that enabled institutional violence against vulnerable populations. Federal mediators arrived to negotiate between Hell's Angels leadership and cemetery administration, whose regulations were being challenged by Motorcycle Club, whose presence demonstrated loyalty that government institutions couldn't command through official channels, requiring diplomatic resolution honoring both Frank's service and federal property management. Gentlemen, we need solution that honors Mr. Monroe's military service while respecting cemetery regulations, announced FBI Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez during meeting that would determine whether individual tragedy escalated into broader confrontation between federal authority and civilian organizations protecting vulnerable veterans. Agent Rodriguez, Frank Monroe earned our loyalty through 30 years of brotherhood and veteran advocacy, replied Bones with dignity that commanded respect despite organizational stereotypes. We demand accountability for unprovoked assault while ensuring his wife receives honor guard she deserves. The negotiation revealed deeper issues about veteran treatment, grief counseling, and institutional accountability that Bradley's individual misconduct had exposed through catastrophic error affecting decorated war hero whose sacrifice deserved honor rather than electrical violence during vulnerable moment requiring compassion. Hell's Angels' peaceful response demonstrated organizational maturity that challenged public stereotypes while establishing legitimacy as veteran advocates whose loyalty protected rather than endangered vulnerable populations requiring institutional support during profound grief that regulations couldn't address adequately. True brotherhood doesn't abandon its own when government fails them. It stands guard until justice restores what violence has broken. Frank's return to Arlington Cemetery was marked by unprecedented cooperation between Hell's Angels and federal authorities, who'd negotiated compromise, allowing supervised honor guard rotations, ensuring Maria wouldn't be alone while respecting cemetery regulations that balanced security concerns with humanitarian needs. Frank, we kept our promise. Maria had protection throughout your hospital stay, Bones reported, while coordinating honor guard schedule that demonstrated organizational discipline transcending public stereotypes about motorcycle clubs, whose loyalty had been tested through crisis requiring diplomatic resolution rather than violent confrontation. Bradley completed court-ordered counseling while beginning victim advocacy work with veterans experiencing mental health crises, his personal recovery enabling recognition of warning signs he'd missed in himself and others during incident that had endangered innocent elderly citizen whose only crime was loving too deeply. Frank, I failed you when you needed compassion most, Bradley said during personal meeting that represented healing for both men whose pain had intersected tragically. My problems became your trauma, and there's no excuse for that betrayal of duty. Frank's response surprised everyone. Derek, hurt people until they get help. You got treatment, made amends, found purpose serving others. That's what Hell's Angels call redemption, earning second chances through changed behavior rather than empty promises. Congressional ceremony honoring Frank Monroe protocol created moment of national healing as President signed legislation transforming individual tragedy into systematic protection for grieving military families, whose cemetery visitations required accommodation rather than enforcement during vulnerable emotional periods. Frank Monroe's courage in testifying despite psychiatric trauma from electrical assault demonstrates service commitment extending beyond military discharge into civilian advocacy for vulnerable veterans whose grief requires institutional support. President declared during Rose Garden ceremony, recognizing both individual heroism and organizational advocacy. Hell's Angels received unprecedented congressional recognition for peaceful response to member assault that had demonstrated organizational maturity, challenging public stereotypes while protecting vulnerable veterans from additional institutional persecution during crisis that tested their commitment to lawful resolution. Hell's Angels East Coast Chapter's disciplined response during Arlington incident demonstrates that motorcycle organizations can serve positive community functions when their loyalty protects vulnerable members from institutional discrimination. House Veterans Affairs Chairman testified during a award ceremony honoring transformed public perception. Implementation of Frank Monroe Protocol faced resistance from cemetery administrations claiming special provisions for grieving military families would complicate security procedures while creating precedent for extended visitations that could overwhelm federal resources during peak burial periods requiring operational efficiency. Frank Monroe Protocol creates logistical complications for cemetery operations while potentially encouraging extended visitations that strain security resources, testified National Cemetery Administration Director during oversight hearing questioning federal mandates affecting local property management procedures and operational efficiency. But Frank's advocacy overcame resistance through Hells Angels' political influence, combined with veteran service organizations whose coalition generated federal funding for implementation while ensuring protocols served intended purposes rather than creating bureaucratic obstacles affecting legitimate cemetery operations. Congress appropriated sufficient funding for Frank Monroe Protocol implementation, recognizing that military family accommodation serves national interests while honoring sacrifice that transcends administrative convenience, announced Senate Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman during budget approval, celebrating legislative victory. Bradley's transformation from assaulting officer to veteran advocate created redemption narrative, inspiring other law enforcement personnel struggling with personal problems affecting professional judgment, while demonstrating that individual healing could create systematic change when people accepted responsibility for harm. Derek Bradley's journey from perpetrator to protector demonstrates that individual accountability combined with appropriate treatment can create positive change when people acknowledge harm while working to prevent future casualties, observed Police Training Director during program evaluation recognizing transformed career trajectory. His victim advocacy program, funded through Frank Monroe Protocol, provided crisis intervention training for law enforcement, encountering veterans experiencing mental health emergencies during emotionally charged situations requiring specialized sensitivity, rather than standard enforcement responses that could escalate rather than resolve crises. Bradley's program prevented 67 similar incidents by teaching de-escalation techniques for grieving military families whose emotional needs require understanding rather than enforcement. Reported training evaluation after second year of implementation demonstrating systematic improvement in veteran treatment. 2 years later, Frank celebrated second anniversary of Maria's death with gratitude rather than despair, understanding that her memory lived through systematic changes protecting other military families from experiencing assault during vulnerable moments requiring compassion rather than compliance with administrative procedures. Hells Angels maintained honor guard rotation at Arlington, while Bradley's advocacy program expanded nationally, proving that individual healing could create institutional transformation when people acknowledged pain rather than projecting it onto others who deserved protection rather than persecution during grief counseling periods. Frank's courage created change that honors Maria's memory through protection for families she never met, observed Bones during anniversary ceremony. Love multiplied through service to others facing similar loss, which is what brotherhood means when tested by tragedy. Frank smiled through tears, honoring both Maria's memory and Hells Angels brotherhood, whose loyalty had transformed personal tragedy into national policy, protecting vulnerable veterans from institutional failures while ensuring their service received honor rather than electrical violence. Derek learned that personal pain can become purpose when channeled toward helping others rather than hurting them. Frank reflected. That's what Maria would have wanted: healing that prevents rather than perpetuates suffering through understanding rather than enforcement. The Frank Monroe Protocol established federal protections for grieving military families while generating $150 million in law enforcement training funding nationwide, ensuring cultural sensitivity education for officers encountering veterans during emotional crises. Bradley's transformation inspired police training programs, preventing 300-plus similar incidents through crisis intervention techniques, recognizing grief as requiring compassion rather than compliance. Hells Angels Honor Guard programs expanded to 15 national cemeteries, while Frank's advocacy created comprehensive grief counseling services for military families whose emotional needs transcended administrative convenience. Arlington Cemetery implemented permanent policy changes ensuring accommodation rather than enforcement for families facing profound loss, requiring extended visitation beyond standard hours. 5 years later, Frank Monroe Protocol had transformed cemetery operations nationwide while establishing Hells Angels as recognized veteran advocacy organization whose peaceful response challenged organizational stereotypes through demonstrated commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from institutional failures. At 77, Frank continued honoring Maria's memory while mentoring other widowers through grief requiring community support rather than individual struggle against bureaucratic indifference. Bradley's victim advocacy program became national model, proving that people who cause harm can become agents of healing when they address personal pain rather than projecting it onto others. They learned that some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the most important battles transform personal pain into protection for others facing similar struggles, creating brotherhood that honors both service and sacrifice. Some battles you fight for country, others for love, but the most important battles transform personal pain into protection for others facing similar struggles.